Thank you everyone for being here. We'd like to thank especially our panelists today for joining us for the discussion on quasi-legal advocacy strategies for addressing human rights abuses. So what we're going to do is I'll introduce everyone, or I'll introduce one of our panelists, and then they'll give a 15-minute speech on the topic. And then we'll move on to the next panelist, and with the remaining time, we'll have questions and answers. Okay, so let's get started. Thomas Becker joins us from the University Network, where he serves as a senior clinical supervisor. As an attorney and activist, he spent most of the past decade working on human rights issues in Bolivia. As a student at Harvard Law School, he was a driving force behind launching a lawsuit against Bolivia's former president and defense minister for their roles in the massacre of indigenous peasants. After graduating, he moved to Bolivia, where he has worked with the survivors for over a decade. He's part of a legal team that has held 7 government officials accountable for genocide in their trial before the Bolivian Supreme Court. In the United States, Becker and his co-counsel obtained a $10 million jury verdict for family members of those killed in Black October, marking the first time a living ex-president has been held accountable in a U.S. court for human rights violations. Becker's human rights work has included investigating torture and extrajudicial killings of Baghdassarian in India, the Sahrawis in Western Sahara, documenting war crimes in Lebanon, Palestine, and Israel, exposing death squads in Honduras, Colombia, and Mexico, investing femicides in South America, and serving as a nonviolent bodyguard for Zapatista guerrillas in Mexico. When he's not practicing law, Becker is an award-winning musician, songwriter, who has recorded with Grammy-winning producers and toured throughout the world as a drummer and guitarist. He's also a mountain climber who's summited peaks all over the world, including Everest. It's a pleasure to have such an accomplished activist as one of our panelists for our first inaugural conference on human rights and accountability. Thomas, we're happy to hear from you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I don't know who originally put all this in my bio, and it's just people seem to keep finding these bizarre things about me being a musician, but thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat true, yes. So first, thank you for inviting me here. Thanks to CFTJ. I'm blown away by this conference that they were able to put together, but not just this conference. I mean, the work they've done during and post-war has been truly exceptional. So, you know, it's an honor to be here. And with panelists, Anoush, for those of you who don't know Anoush, you will know her. She will become a rock star human rights lawyer. She was a student of mine at Harvard and really was the impetus to get me involved in work in Armenia. Currently, I'm working on a report with Harvard and Yale and some other schools on Wesleyan on abuses post-war, and really Anoush was the impetus to that. And Tigran, he'll speak for himself, but is exceptional. I met him through this work, and you know, I don't like to use the word victim because I think folks like Tigran are not victims. They've taken pain and sorrow and turned it into, taken that energy and become exceptional activists. So it truly is an honor to be with folks here. So today, I actually am going to change completely what I'm going to talk about. I had prepared other stuff. I had videos and photos and all the bells and whistles. But after a couple days of this conference, I decided I wanted to talk about something a little more hopeful. You know, hearing stories of these atrocious abuses reminded me of when I was here just a few months ago talking to a lot of the victims and survivors. And there was this sense of disillusionment and lack of hope that really stood out to me. That was upsetting and still is upsetting. And so today I wanted to talk about hopeful things because I do have a lot of hope for the struggle here. I don't want to overstate my optimism. I do think that this is a really challenging struggle. I think justice is always hard, and I think this is uniquely difficult. To be honest, I don't think if you mention Artsakh to the international community, they say, what is Artsakh? I think as an American, I can tell you most Americans couldn't find Armenia on a map. I'm not sure how many know that Armenia is a country. So unfortunately, Artsakh is off the radar, and that makes it really challenging. And then you have other issues. You have the war in Ukraine, which has really monopolized press attention to human rights abuses. It's made it harder to draw attention to other abuses. You have the fact that people, this was mentioned the first day, people are burnt out post-COVID. You've maxed out on empathy. And then you have all sorts of complicated geopolitical issues, Turkey, Russia, the United States. This is hard. So I don't want to overstate the optimism, but I do have hope. And forgive me if this sounds cliche, but I think what gives me hope is the amazing activists that are working on this. The way that people mobilized from the diaspora to local Armenians during the conflict and post-conflict, I genuinely think is an example for the rest of the world. I mean, it's really been moving to see CFTJ, the work they've done, gathering testimonies in such challenging times. But it's the coalition of people that has really inspired me, because it's not just lawyers. You have everyday, academics, non-lawyers, victims, survivors, students that are doing things ranging from collecting testimonies to driving into Artsakh to bring people out, to bring carpets out. So it's this collective resistance and genuine care about what's taking place that I think does give me hope. And it reminds me a lot of, and this is what I'm going to switch to, is work I've done in Bolivia on a case against the ex-president of Bolivia. Because I think the way that people mobilized here with a victim-centered approach and this coalition of lawyers and non-lawyers and students and activists reminds me a lot of what we did in Bolivia, and is a pretty inspiring story. I mean, at the end of the day, indigenous Bolivians in the highlands that really, if you go to the highlands of Bolivia, it looks a lot like Artsakh, took down the ex-president, one of the richest, most powerful people in the history of Bolivia, launched this historic lawsuit and won the first lawsuit against a living ex-president in the history of the United States. And I found a lot of parallels between what folks here are doing and folks in Bolivia did. And in the beginning, everyone said, you guys cannot do this. And they did. So I kind of want to talk about a happy story after a couple of days of really challenging stories about what's been taking place, what took place and was still taking place in Artsakh. I'm going to assume most people don't know much about Bolivia. Most people in the world don't. My own family, half the time they think I'm in Botswana or Bosnia. So I understand most people don't know about Bolivia, and they certainly don't know about Black October. I mean, this is one of the parallels, is that I think it just simply was off the radar for many people. So I'm going to just briefly give the Cliff Notes version, the highlight reel of Bolivian history and Black October, because I want to talk more about the victims and their struggle and the coalition between victims, and then the use, I mean, this panel is on legal and non-legal tactics and this kind of marriage between the two, and how I think they were able to get justice because they used both legal and non-legal tactics. So Bolivia is the most indigenous country in the Americas. Roughly 2/3 of the country is indigenous, Aymara, Quechua, and some other smaller indigenous groups. But historically, since the Spanish came, it's been exclusively run by non-indigenous, people that look like me, Spanish ancestry. And they've repressed the indigenous, despite them being a majority. This changed during Black October. That was kind of the impetus to the first indigenous president. This was kind of a changing point. But Black October, up until Black October, it had always been ruled by gringos, as they say in Bolivia. Bolivia is one of the most resource-rich countries on the planet. It has the highest lithium reserves, second highest gas reserves in South America, all sorts of minerals. I mean, it was literally the epicenter of the Spanish Empire. But again, it's always been the ruling elite, the Spanish, who benefited from this. It's been this contradictory country, because on the one hand, it's so incredibly rich, but it's the poorest country in South America. It has the highest inequality rate, and it is the indigenous that are always at the bottom of the ladder. And this changed in 2003. People rose up, people protested. At the time, there was a president, Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada. He was known for privatizing many of the industries. Much of the critiques were he allegedly, sold off the industries to his friends or corporations like Enron in the United States for way below market value. So none of the money actually went back to everyday Bolivians. So Bolivians protested. And rather than negotiate with the protesters, he sent the military out, and the military gunned down the protesters. The first victim was an 8-year-old child named Marlene Nancy Rojas in a town of Worisata. It's honestly, Worisata reminds me of Artsakh. It's a small town kind of at the base of some mountains, very rural, and a sniper killed her. And there were already really big mobilizations against this privatization, but when this child was killed, then the whole country erupted. And in part because of the government response. The government said, no, the protesters, these people, they're terrorists, they're communists, they're guerrillas. Certainly no 8-year-old child is a guerrilla soldier. So the country rose up. And over the next month, he continued to mobilize military and kill and gun down protesters, indigenous protesters. 100% of the people killed and injured were protesters. At the end of the month, roughly 700 were killed or injured. And he fled to the United States. His coalition broke down. Nobody supported him at this point. So he fled to the United States and still lives in the United States. And after the killings, I remember, you know, basically the attitude was, okay, now we move on. There's nothing to do. You can't hold someone like him accountable. He's the ex-president. He's quite literally one of the richest, most powerful people in the history of the country. And ex-presidents never get held accountable. There's a horrific history of a culture of impunity that is really pervasive in Bolivia. So everybody said, you know, there's nothing you can do. And the victims, who are amongst some of the poorest in the country, said, not this time. We're going to do something about it. And so they launched a case in Bolivia called a juicio de responsabilidades, a trial of responsibilities. To bring a trial against high-level officials, you need a specialized trial. And so you need a trial of responsibilities. But unfortunately, it wouldn't move forward. All the proof was there. These are really, I mean, the really strong proof against the officials involved in these massacres, but there was not the political will. So the families took it upon themselves to make the political, change the politicians' minds. And this is where they employed legal tactics, non-legal tactics, and even illegal tactics. So in Bolivia, you need a 2/3 vote to have a trial of responsibility. They did not have 2/3 at this point. So they embarked on letter writing campaigns, signature campaigns. They garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures from across the world. But like I said, they did some illegal things, civil disobedience. They occupied Congress. They entered Congress with photos with the faces of their loved ones the size of my body. And it was a shame. They shamed these Congress people who wouldn't vote for this. It was an embarrassment to have plastered on the walls, these people looking at them. They rose their dead from the ground. So in Aymara culture, once you're in the ground, you remain with Mother Earth. You are not to come out. And they dug up their bodies and walked through the streets with the caskets, which again, this was such a controversy in Bolivia. This was front page news. This was an embarrassment that they had to go to these extreme measures to get justice for their family members. And this was the thing, these kind of extra legal actions were kind of what were the tipping point. They were what actually, I think, sparked the trial. I have such limited time, so I'm going to try to, again, a Cliff Notes version of what took place. But, you know, we brought the government officials to trial in Bolivia at the Supreme Court and won a case in 2011 for genocide. Everybody was sentenced for genocide and sentenced to a number of years in jail. But Goni, the ex-president, Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, he fled to the United States. He couldn't be tried in absentia. So the families decided, well, we'll go after him. Again, the rest of the country said, come on, there's nothing you can do about it. So they attempted to extradite Goni. The government sent an extradition request, and for the last decade and a half, it's just collected dust. It's actually unprecedented. The government just simply hasn't responded. You know, a lot of this is, as a lawyer, I'm not suggesting this, but a lot of the critiques were Goni's connections with U.S. government officials were really powerful. His lawyers, his incredibly powerful legal team have represented the last 4 presidents of the United States. So the press and folks in Bolivia said, look, there's no way you can extradite him. So the family started looking to alternatives. I rarely like to talk about my role in this because I think it has been the victims that have been the driving force and done 99% of the work. But because so many students have been involved, particularly CFTJ, these amazing students, women students that are just incredible, I should highlight that the role that students play and the amount of change you can bring. So when I was a student, a first-year student at Harvard, or in law school, I read about this random statute to go after pirates. It was something we read about in passing. And it was nothing big. I just kind of like put it in the file box in my head. And it was a statute that's been used to go after human rights violators in the United States. And I won't talk too much about it because I know that Judith Chomsky, who's speaking later, is going to talk more about it. But it's been used for human rights cases. So I returned to Bolivia after my first year of law school, and we talked about, we can give this a try. It seems completely ridiculous. I mean, really, the number of cases successfully litigated of human rights in the United States, I could probably count on 2 hands. But we'll give it a try. Why not? And we brought this case, and instantly it was a success. Because I think a lot of times lawyers, we think of success as, you know, winning a trial. I think there are many victories all along the process. And just filing alone shined a spotlight on what took place. At this point, nobody was talking about what happened. But the second that we filed this in a U.S. court system, their ex-president being tried for extrajudicial killings in the United States, all of a sudden the Washington Post was interested, the New York Times. So we started to garner interest for the first time in a number of years since the massacres took place. We moved forward on the trial, and I'm going to, again, Cliff Notes it, unfortunately, because we have a short amount of time. Filed in 2007, and in 2018, we won, despite what everybody said. And Aymara peasants, some of the poorest people in the poorest country of South America, took down Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, one of the richest, most powerful people in the country's history. And the moving part to me is these folks that were told over and over and over, you can do nothing. This guy's intocable, as they say in Spanish. He's untouchable. Campesino farmers from Bolivia changed Bolivia forever. It changed the country, changed the jurisprudence in the United States, changed the culture of impunity that you know, the United States has served as a refuge for people who have committed atrocious abuses. This has changed the conversation. And it's folks that were told they couldn't do it. And I think it was the mixture of, one, I think the combination of legal and non-legal tactics, the political pressure, the grassroots activism that they did that made, they couldn't have done this with a legal campaign. We wouldn't have had a trial without the non-legal activism that they did. I don't think they would have won just with the activism. I think that like the marriage between the two is what actually brought justice. And I think it's been the interesting coalition between, I mean, it's been a victim-centered approach, but it's been a partnership between activists and lawyers, victims, survivors, family members, students, and that really mimics what folks are doing here. I think it's through that genuine solidarity that you actually bring real lasting change. And I think, again, it's a rough one here, but I have hope because of these organic coalitions that people have created here and the genuine interest in justice for the victims. And I know that I'm out of time. So I will talk more about strategies and stuff when questions pop up, but I want to make sure that I don't go over. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Thomas. That was really interesting. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Anoush Baghdassarian, who is the co-founder of the Rerouted Archive, a project that documents over 200 testimonies from Syrian Armenian refugees who fled Syria in the last 10 years. She also has a career focus on transitional justice. Thank you for timing, so helpful. Transitional justice and international criminal law. As the Harvard Law School International Legal Studies Fellow, she will serve as a visiting professional at the International Criminal Court starting this December, followed by United States Federal Judicial Clerkship on the Second Circuit starting in 2024. Some of her other work experience includes serving as an advisor to the Armenian Permanent Mission to the UN and completing internships with the United States Department of Justice, U.S. Department of State, U.S. Senate, and the Center for Justice and Accountability, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Anoush, we're so excited to hear from you.
Oh, not at all. Well, first of all, Thomas, we have so much to learn from you. So thank you for everything, for being here, for everything that you've taught me so far, and for everything that you're doing for us and for underdogs around the world, I guess. And I hope that I'm going to be fast so we get time for questions, so we can get more of your insight. Is the presentation up that I can click through it? Oh, it is. Great. Okay. And then I also just want to thank CFTJ. I know I work with you, but it's a privilege to be here speaking and to be on this panel with like really incredible and inspiring people. And I think most of what I'm going to present on, and I won't give I'm not trying to teach anybody anything, but most of what I want to present on will be about how we can continue amplifying the voices that we are already working with and gathering, not just through CFTJ, but everybody in Armenia who is working with the victims to make sure that they are the ones centering and pushing forward the transitional justice efforts. The justice efforts. It's not really transitional justice, but I just wanted to give this quote about the interview and how this is really the heart of justice processes. And so I'm going to talk today about a little bit about Rerouted, but then about how we can take things that I've done with Rerouted to this context. So Rerouted is an archive of, like Olivia said, 200 interviews with Syrian Armenians. And many of the interviews, most of them have been conducted here with Syrian Armenians who have left Syria in the last 10 years and come to Armenia. But we've also interviewed people in France and Australia and Argentina, etc. For three main reasons: to preserve, educate, and to serve justice efforts. So preservation, the Syrian Armenians are one of the are still one of the strongest Armenian diaspora communities in the world. They preserve their Armenians so well. They preserve the culture so well, the language. And so to preserve a snapshot of what that community was like before the war, there were about 100,000 Syrian Armenians living in Syria, and now there are maybe about 30,000. And so to preserve a snapshot of that rich community, to educate, we have actually, I'll shout out Olivia. Olivia's worked with Rooted for about 2 years now, and she created lesson plans for us and other forms of education to have this kind of material be included in classrooms to learn about the Syrian conflict, but also an ethnic and religious minority in Syria. And for justice efforts, that's where a lot of my work goes. Similarly to this idea of nobody's going to care about us or our justice efforts. I was working at Human Rights Watch before starting this, and I met with a Chadian torture survivor, Suleiman Gengang, who had just won. After 17 years, they finally were able to convict Habre, the ex-dictator of Chad. And he said that after being tortured, he got out and said, we need to start collecting testimonies. We need to start preserving the evidence. And everybody said, no way, you're not going to, Habre is not going to be held accountable. It's a useless and fruitless effort. But like many of the people who were here at this conference, he didn't give up, and he worked to collect these testimonies, and there was justice. So that was part of the impetus for this, to collect these testimonies to make sure that the Syrian Armenians who have faced 100 years of displacement and whose voices weren't being included in the justice efforts for Syria, with most of the justice efforts focusing on the majority communities, their harms were included in the efforts if they wanted to be. And so I want to just play this for you, because I think the point of this will be is that the victims are the most important to center here. So I want to play this video for you, and then go from there. How do you play it? Can you click the video? No? I still want to watch it, so if we can make it work, let's try that, but I can talk about what I was going to talk about afterwards to save time. So after, I really think yeah, it works? Oh, great. Okay. So I'm going to talk about how there are different, on this spirit of quality. Okay, great.
Հալեբչի մտնել են մոտ գեշ ժամ վրաչ ճամփան ձայրաները գեցուցին նման ավտոբուսը ամեն գեշ ժամ մեկ ժամ անգամ քրոջս հետ գաբեի թե ինչպես հասակ ուրեք ինչ է ճամփան շատ երկար էր վերջին անգամ սկսալ այլևս հեռախոսները անհասանելի միտք սպառով թե ուր են արդեն մեկ երկու ժամ վերջ է որ գրծա հետ գաբել քրոջս հարցի թե ուր է սա մեզ ինչ է ցուցին Սիգուրիկ սա բասինչ տեղն է, բասինչ քյուրն է։ Լավ ինչ, նստեր կսպասենք սա չեմ կրետ, մեկը փոմ չխոսի որ։ Արդեն այդ գիշեր ինչ անդեղ ցուցին, այդ ինչ վիճակի մեջ էր, մեկ ասված գիտե։ Ես խենթ վիճակի մեջ, որ այլևս վերջացավ, ինձ ցերկերին անցավ վերջ, այլևս պիտի YouTube-ին ինչ մի տեսնենք, որ ինչպես կմորթվին, որ կամ ինչպես ինչ կլավը։ Ետք միտքս ինգավ, այդ քյուրի մեջ մեր վարպետներուն վիլլային բահագը որ գար շատ ծանոթ է ինձ, բայց գիտեմ ասկյուղեն էր։ Սի փորձեմ նայեմ, բայց ինչ որ գիտեմ ասմարտնալ իրանց մեն եղել է։ Բայց մեր մեջ շատ մոդերնություն կար, այլ ասկել։ Սի փորձեմ զանգել։ Զանգեցի։ Մարդը շատ լավ ձևով պատասխանեց, սկսա լալու հերացանի մեջ թե ոտքդ բակնեմ։ Երեխաներս ընտանիքս փոքր է, մի ջարմար է, եթե կրնաս։ Ուրեն ինչ են արդեն զարմացավ, ասի որ գետնին չեմ գիտեր։ Հիմա քեզ գրոջ ստիլը գուարգեմ, դու նետը գաբիր նայ ուրեն ինչ է։ Մստեի համբերեի 1 ժամ, 2 ժամ ցայնող չկար։ Համբերանքս չի մնաց։ Սի զանգեմ նայեմ ուրեն։ Զանգեցի բարեկամին, սա զնոսկը հետս է ասավ։ Երեխաներդ հետս է ասավ, մի վախնար։ Մարդ արավ իրենց իրեն դունը դարավ։ Հակուսնին փոխեցին, իսլամական հակուսն է, որ չիմանան, որ հայ, չնե հայ եսել ու մորդ է։ 12 օր այդ ծևով մարդ ինքը բահեց, ոչ մեկ մարդ մոդենալով, ան որ գահարցնեց ես, դուք այլասկ եք, արդեն միդի չի երեք, բայց դեսնես հագարակ մարդ հարցուց մարդ տեսավ, ծեր հապվածքով սիք որ մենք հայ չենք։ Այդ ծևով 12 օր մատյալ մնացին։ Արդեն ճիշտ 12 օր անցեր էր, պետք է ջար չի գա, միդի ոյի մեկ ծևով պետք է որ այդտեղ են հանենք դուրս։ 12 օր են ջարին հետևն էինք, մինչև որ վարորդ մի եկավ, այլևս ինչի դասեմ քեզ գամ շատ ուժեղ, սիրտ ուժեղ կար անցմներ գամալ անխելք մեկներ։ Պերին որ իբր թե ինքը աս մարդը, աս քյուրեն իրենց կողմեն մինչև մեր զորքին գոմ բիդը հասցնե, որ հոմս քաղաքը գա, քյուրեն մեկը։ Ասել է որ ես կդանեմ։ Որով ոչ մի մարդ չի կարա իրենց կողմեն մեր զորքին մոդենալ, ոչ ալ մենք կնանք մեր կողմեն իրենց աս մարդը, սա ես կդանեմ։ Երբ կհասնին հոմսի առաջի քիծը, որ մեր զորքը տեղն են, կհասնին անցնակիները նայելով զորքերն ես, թե կհասնի վարորդին անցնակիրը նայելով մարդն գզարում զինվորդի որտեղից եկել ես, ինչ սիրտով եկել ես։ Վարի չեպսած ադեն արդեն քույրս ինքը կհասնում, իրեն գամոզեմ ու, թե ասմարդն է մեզ ազատեց, ասմարդը որ չէ մենք վերջացել ենք։ Եթե իրական սիրտ ունիք, այդ բարիքտյունը որ միդենես տո երտայինք նա երեխան։ Աստыз մի որ պարեսիպ մեկ ելավ, պարեսիպ զինողում ուներ, ետ անցնակիրը տարծուց իրան։ Սա ետ գյուղը տարծիպած առանց մեկ եդև նայելու, մարդը տոնան արավ, անցնակինան արավ, ետ ճապա դարձավ։ Բայց այդ մարդը որ չլար, անգարելի որ մեկը գնա հասցնել։ Արդեն ապահով վեցան, մեր զորքին մեր շրջաները մտան, ադի ամենամեծ պարկն էր, բայց կմնա գենս որ չեր ոչ մեկ պար, միան գուլար զավակներս պիտի դեսնեմ, բայց հոմսկյորի մեջ ենք, միջև իրեն զավակներոտ հասնիս 8-9 ժամ գուզես և ճամպաները ռիսկ պագ են։ Նորեն կեցած են ետ չի մնաց, բայց վերջավորության մայր էր, շատ զորավոր ռիսկի մեջ մտավ, առանց մեկում պամասել եմ։ Լսեցինք, որ մի քանի ժամ ճամպան պացվել էր, արդեն լինդան ճամպան էր։ Արդեն ռիսկ չեմ գարասել կեզի, որ իսկական խելքը կլուխ մարդ եթե լար այդ անգարինի որ ճամպայել էր։ Եվ ավտոբուսին մեջ, երավագայ մեծ ավտոբուսները որ գան, դղամարդ, այլասկ, այդ ալասներում մեջ, ինչը որ միդիկա երախաները դեսնել։ Ինչի ճամպան ինձի կսպաննեն, ինձի ճամպան կողանան, ինչ ուզեն թոնեմ, բայց պիտի հասնիմ երախաներս։ Ոչ մեկում մարդը, ոչ հերախոսից չեր բնասխան։
Նման անչադեցի երախոսից։
Որ մենք ոչ մեկ չի գապրի։
Ինչև խոմս հասնի։ Խոմս չի հասա։ Ուրիշ դեղ հասցուցնձի, անդեղեն ուրիշ օտո արիսի կարևոր է հարևեն դուրսելում։ Ամենամեծ ռիսկն էր, որ հարևեն դուրսելում։ Արդեն ելարն է, արդեն անդեղ 1000 ժամպարը գտնես։ Իրենց ավտոնը, որ ես մեջ ելային կլիպանան գերտար, որ նման ճամպան դարբեր է, սա մենք կեզի խոմս չեմ գրնամացնել։ Դունեցի ճամպան, լիպարանի սահմանը ծկե, ուր գուզես ծկե, ես խուսկ ճա, միան հանե, ինչ գուզես դամ կեզի, դղա մարդ են ըսա, սեսա դղա մարդ եմ, Mazıt siyasa himago kotsiyum sigana stim çeredi. Bidmernis bidabris mes kukuirde medet gelim kurusi bidiyelim. Kasa. Ante kasa. Si.
And that's her children. So I showed this because, and that's the majority of my presentation were their voices, because just like the work CFTJ is doing, I see the great importance of highlighting the voices of the people who have experienced the harms. And I think that's also the way to advocate for justice for these efforts. So in the spirit of the quasi-legal advocacy of this panel, you have all the UN efforts and you have the actual litigation efforts, but you also have education lesson plans. You also have, there's one student who reached out to us who wants to use our testimonies in a composition that he's making, in like an orchestra composition that he's composing, to overlay the voices on the music as a way of preserving the culture. There are I want to also talk about the qualitative and quantitative surveys that I think we can bring into this that bridges social science with justice. So we have an MOU with the IIIM, so we're contributing the testimonies to the documentation efforts for Syria so that if there ever were to be a case that was relevant to the harms that Syrian Armenians have experienced, they'd be able to use the testimonies that we've collected. And then the quantitative and qualitative science, social science survey, I can send this to whoever wants it, but what I did was in my master's, I went through, I made a 50-question survey that asked about what would justice look like to you for the Syrian conflict. And then I also asked about the Armenian genocide to compare them. And there's so many, and this is what I think really is the point, there's so many different answers to what justice is. It can be a case, but it can also be a memorialization. It can also be, in Germany, they have these cobblestones on the floor that commemorate where people were taken from their homes during the Holocaust. They have on the train platforms engravings on the floor that say this train went to Auschwitz with this many people and this many over this period of time. So when I asked what, and in both cases, what they'd want for justice, I got results. And these are just 50 people. And so again, I can share this whoever wants, but lots of different answers for what justice is. And I think that that's what we should continue to do for the conflict here with Artsakh, is to bridge social science and arts and law all together, with the base foundation of all of that being the voices of the people who have experienced the harms and letting them guide us in the direction of justice. These are some of the reports we've written to the UN. But that's it for my presentation. I only brought up Rerooted to show that that this effort is going on in so many different contexts, and we have so much to learn from each other, and that justice needs to be immediately, first and foremost, guided by the people who experienced it. And so, as a segue, I'll hand it over to Tico.
So let me introduce you first, Tigran. So Tigran Ambardaryan is one of our distinguished speakers who's born and raised in Shirak, Armenia. After graduating from the Vazgen Sarkisyan Military University, he joined the Armenian Armed Forces and was promoted to the rank of captain in 2020 and served as a soldier during the 2020 war. Tigran has always been an advocate for the safe return of Armenians illegally held in captivity in Azerbaijan, but it was not until his own brother, Mels, became a prisoner of war that he devoted all his time to ensuring the repatriation of not only all POWs, but his brother as well. After 10 months of not knowing if he would ever see his brother again, Tigran would continuously visit the Erebuni airport to see if his brother would be one of the prisoners of war who would come out of those doors. And that finally happened on October 18th, we're happy to say. So, though Mels has returned home, Tigran continues to fight for all people imprisoned in Azerbaijan still. So we're very happy to have him here and hear about his experience. So Tigran, over to you.
Dear guests, I'll try to present the situation with POWs. I'll divide my speech into three parts. In the first part, I will address on what happened when the guys were imprisoned, were taken captive in Azerbaijan. Then I will address the Geneva Convention violations by Azerbaijan, how they were kept in prisons and convicted. And in the third part, I'll try to express my opinion, my perspective on what can be done to contribute to the guys coming back. On September 27th, 2020, when Azeri aggression started, we tried to pay our debt to our motherland. I was serving in the armed forces of Armenia. I was an officer, and Mels, once he knew about the war, he immediately joined the volunteers and went to Artsakh. He went through the entire war. Then on November 9th, the ceasefire was signed, and then Mels came back. I was continuing my service in Chartar village of Marduni region. We were preserving that area without knowing what's going to happen the next day. And I received a call from Mels. He was telling he needs to go to the front line again as a volunteer. This is important to mention. On November 28th, December 13th, the group from Shirak, the 100 group from Shirak, was protecting Khatsabert and Hintager villages of Artsakh. Then on December 23rd, an Azeri aggression took place again when the Azeri again violated the provisions of the agreement. They entered the area under the Armenian forces. Shooting started. 9 Armenian soldiers were killed and 64 were taken as captives. It's important to mention that Azeris, when they did this first, so they cheated, they took them to Baku, they violated their rights, they didn't let them protect their interests, and in an illegal way they started trials. Within a month, we had no information about them, meaning the Azeri party hasn't officially confirmed their being there, their being alive. On the first day, we saw that according to the Third Geneva Convention, the country that takes captives is obliged to give a right for a phone call and create relevant conditions. In this case, it wasn't like that. They were kept in Azeri prisons in inhumane conditions, and for a long time they didn't have a right to make phone calls, to get in contact. For the first time, I received information from Mels on January 21st, when with help of the Red Cross and Russian forces commander, I got a call. I understood that my brother was alive and other guys are also in Azerbaijan. Although there were 64 guys initially, they were telling 62 and were hiding information about the other 2 people. With time, after cooperating with the Truth and Justice Center and other public governance authorities, we were able to force Azerbaijan to confirm that these guys are also in their country, they are alive, and to let ICRC visit there. First, they issued health documents, health statements, and certain conditions were improved. The problem was this was the first stage, and it seemed they're about to return. We thought that soon they will give them back as prisoners of wars. Then for months, Azerbaijan was putting preconditions, land related, and they were changing the conditions all the time, which was unacceptable because a person cannot be traded for, and it is already a crime. Then the trials started, the judicial proceedings started, and when males and others were accused of crossing the Armenian-Azeri border illegally, trying to make explosives, and they were accused of organizing terrorism. All of us know this is a myth, because we have proved 100 times to Azerbaijan that our guys were in the part under Armenian control, according to the November 9 agreement. Then they were volunteers. They were protecting their lives and the state border only, and except the necessary weapons, they had nothing. Currently, 38 and more persons are kept in Azerbaijani prisons. I also have information that there are other people kept in Azeri prisons, but Azerbaijan doesn't accept this circumstance. We have facts on 90 of them, and we presented them in the European Court, confirming that at that moment those people were alive, and the Azeri side has either to give them back, to return them, or to provide an explanation about what happened to those people. It's very important to mention that 62 people were taken together in Khatsabert, but the Azeri side returned 30 of them and convicted and sentenced other 32 to 10 years imprisonment. Our problem is to focus our efforts to be able to protect the interests of Armenian prisoners of war in the European Court. And it is necessary to provide all testimonies and evidences collected by the center and other offices motivated, interested in justice. I know this problem exists in all countries worldwide, and it's very important for us to make a first step to protect the human rights and not allow things like this happen in the world. This is all. If you have questions, you're welcome.
Շատ շնորհակալություն Տիգրան ջան։ Ձեր աշխատանքը շատ կարևոր է ու yeah, wow, cool. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to move into the question and answer section. So if you have questions, please submit them. I will selfishly ask one first because I'm up here, so I get to do that. So to all the panelists, you shared really wonderful examples of approaches to redressing human rights abuses that are non-legal. I'm wondering if we can get a little bit more examples of these kinds of things. How can a person like me, or maybe a person in the audience who has no legal background at all, how can we take action to support legal efforts or support other ways to redress human rights abuses? How do we push for justice?
I would like to mention that I myself do not have legal background. And most important fact is that general information is needed on specific matters of interest, and we need to know which organizations, which legal organizations, what levers have in order to be able to address these problems and issues, because this is our challenge, our problem, and we need to take ownership and be able to raise this issue and talk about it in different platforms.
Thank you.
Where?
You should go. One just quick thing that I would say is some of those other methods that I didn't list off are getting curriculums and textbooks about these things, and having laws passed to stop to stop funding arms. So there's a lot of like education advocacy, advocacy through policy, through political realms. Doctors have been involved through identifying wounds and figuring out which weapons they've come from. I really think there is a place for each person in their career to be involved. And with this conflict in particular, we can come up with, answers together of what ways there are, but there definitely are ways.
I'll just speak briefly. I'm the worst law professor because I'm always telling my students, don't use the law. Because I think there's this default, we must litigate. But it's really hard to win litigation. And there's this faith that the system's going to work. And it doesn't a lot of the times, most of the times. So I think that I guess I see myself as an activist. I have a toolbox, and one of the tools I use is the law, but often it's not. Like I said, ranging from, I participated, maybe as a lawyer I shouldn't have, when we occupied Congress, in part because we figured they're gonna check the gringos. So we basically filled my body with all the posters, and that's how we were able to get in. But I think drawing attention, this is one of the big issues, I think, for here and Bolivia and a lot of places. If the world doesn't know about it, boy, it makes it a lot tougher. So I think there's many ways to get people's attention, ranging from protests to, less illegal tactics. Well, not that protest is illegal, but I think that you need to draw attention. You need to be creative. And I think part of it is, first and foremost, I think you always need to look to the victims for guidance. I think they know what they need best. Sometimes a 15-year case, the case we've been working on against the ex-president took a decade and a half. I started this as a student, and now I'm like, getting gray hairs. The amount of time that we've spent on this has been incredible. And sometimes that's not what the victims need. They maybe just need to eat. That's maybe a more urgent issue for them. So I think we always want to look to the people who've been affected most to see what they need. If it is a legal process, then we go through the legal process. I think there's a myriad of ways that you can draw attention to issues. And I think being strategic and capitalizing, again, the rest of the world doesn't care. How do you make them care? And I think there's moments, there's the anniversary of the genocide is a good space to get, nobody's going to write about, unfortunately, Artsakh, but that's a good moment to say, wow, on the anniversary, we're still struggling in the way that we did 100 years ago, whatever. I think there's ways to be creative. And I think capitalizing on things like that, in Bolivia, for instance, is a separate issue, but there was a coup in 2019. Nobody knew what happened. In fact, they were really sharp and had a really strong lobbying campaign in the way that Azerbaijan has been really good at creating a completely different narrative. They lobbied Congress, they hired a US consulting firm to completely just make up lies, and it was very effective. And so to get positive press for the victims of the coup in 2019 took being really creative, and it took little things like, despite all this really horrific, honestly, video footage, real clear evidence of abuses, nobody cared. But then when Elon Musk made some really arrogant tweet about, we'll coup whoever we want, that actually created a space where everybody could actually push back and say, this is a coup, you're joking about that? Maybe he was serious. I think it was more of a joke, but the international press, the US press cared. And that was the thing that we were able to capitalize on to draw attention to all these abuses. So I think being really creative and going with the flow, I think maybe this is, again, maybe as a lawyer, this is not what you teach in law school, but I think strategically throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, because you never know. And I think you have to try different approaches because it's an uphill battle.
So, Thomas, you started this panel with a discussion about hopefulness generally, and in the context of this conference here, you know, it's been a heavy couple of days, and you spoke from a place of saying that you have a certain amount of hope. First, I'd like to ask you specifically, and the other panelists, one, how do you keep hope in this kind of work, both either as legal professionals or working in quasi-legal ways, as the title of this panel is? How do you keep hope individually? And then maybe even a little bit more importantly for the conference as a whole, how do communities keep hope? How can we keep hope collectively?
Start. Well, so then I'll go back to the case against Goni, because I think it's a perfect example. I mean, well, I'll start with me. I get oxygen from the communities I work with. I'm constantly inspired. I'm not just saying this because I'm sitting on a panel. I think Tigran and folks like him are incredible. I'm genuinely moved by them. And that's what allows me to keep doing this. I make no money being a human rights lawyer. I've never made a dollar as a lawyer. I get paid as a professor when I occasionally teach. I try to avoid teaching so that I can do my human rights work as much as possible. It's people on the ground that are incredibly involved in these struggles that keep me interested. And I think the important thing is, again, this is why maybe I know I keep repeating myself, but it needs to be focused on the victims. And I think the more involved they are, the more they can continue the struggle. As I mentioned, you know, we've launched our trial against Goni in 2007. We started building it years before. This has been creeping up on 20 years. This is 19 years the victims have suffered. That's a really long time to sit through a lawsuit. And I think if it was a very top-down approach in our lawsuit where the lawyers were doing everything, it would feel really tiring for the folks that are just waiting for justice. But they're involved every single step of the way. So they feel invested in this. They will fight for the next 1,000 years, if they can live that old. The fight will continue with them. And it's because they've been at the forefront. They've been in the driver's seat. I am a tool for them. In the sense that I said I have a toolbox and I pick out of my toolbox, I'm one of the tools, hopefully, that they can use. And so they're driving this. And when you're invested in that, you feel energized and the struggle stays alive. And so the struggle in Bolivia, I mean, I've seen a lot of struggles around the world are the same, where if you put the community in front and they are in the driver's seat, they don't get tired. They feel empowered. I mean, I think being an activist can be, you're confronting these really horrific things, but it can be incredibly empowering. And I think people feel pride in the work and the struggle. And so I think keeping the families, the communities at the forefront is central.
Just to echo that, I found that in the first time I ever did this with interviewing the Syrian Armenians that summer, from 9 a.m. to 1 a.m. I'd be interviewing people because their stories and their the desire to speak and share their story, I think in and of itself was a form of justice, or at least of recognition, of acknowledgement, of having somebody hear there's your story. There's a theory of ethical loneliness that I've read about that says it's the experience of being abandoned by humanity, compounded by the feeling the injustice of not being heard, and that resonated with me at least so deeply of this feeling that I have been passed down to me, at least for the genocide, of this ethical loneliness that humanity had abandoned for allowing this to happen, and then the injustice of having it every time we'd go protest in America I wasn't there for 100 years, but for my lifetime, and nothing was moving forward. It felt like an injustice to not be heard, another second wound or an open wound someone was poking a finger in. And anyway, seeing that, talking to people every day was bringing, people would go on for hours when the interview was supposed to be only 1 hour, was in and of itself its own form of alleviating that sense of ethical loneliness. And so I think that is energizing, and that brings hope to both sides, that the asking of the questions is worthwhile and meaningful, as is the answering of them, to then promote other justice efforts. But that in of itself is an effort that is meaningful and worthwhile.
նախ ուզում եմ նշել, որ քանի
So I would like to mention that this is not just an issue for a single person, but by dealing with these problems on a daily basis, we try to look for new solutions and identify those. And we need to be to make sure that we are able to move forward and achieve our ultimate goals, and we need to make sure that since we are able basically to return the last prisoner of war. I would like also to talk about the Center for Truth and Justice, which shared the problems with us and became a big family together with us, which helped us, also empowered us to go together, to move forward and try to address the problems and be able to achieve our goals.
Okay, now I want to ask a little bit about dealing with the different human rights abuses that you've all worked on and how you've potentially collaborated in quasi-legal strategies with victims, community groups from other areas of the world or different kinds of human rights groups, and how that's either helped or made more challenging your efforts towards redressing your grievances or the grievances of victims and communities.
I probably have maybe a shortest example, shorter than Thomas at least, just because I have this one case study. The Syrian Armenian community is a small one compared to the other Syrian communities that have been harmed and that are seeking redress and justice. And so collaborating with other NGOs working on Syria has been incredibly helpful. And we've been welcomed with open arms. And, you know, when I did that survey that I showed you, I would have maybe liked for the answer to be that the Syrian Armenians would have liked there to be litigation, because I never heeded Thomas's lessons of trying to use the other tools in the toolkit that weren't law, and I wanted to try to build a case, but the answers were not that. The three top things that from my 50-person survey that the Syrian Armenians wanted for justice were: 1, rebuilding infrastructure; 2, ensuring minority protections in Syria if there is a new government or even if this government continues; and 3, reunifying the country, because they said that they lived together very peacefully and well with their neighbors, and now there's so many factions and divisions, and they want reunification. So well, I went to law school, so I only thought I knew how to, I was only learning how to build cases. But so working with those other NGOs was really helpful to understand how to best achieve those other forms of justice that I didn't have the toolkit, besides writing UN reports that I showed you that say, hey, Commission of Inquiry, you should investigate the harms that Syrian Armenians experienced and help with this effort to reunify or this or that. I didn't have any other tools, so working with those other NGOs that work on Syria has been really helpful.
I would say solidarity. International solidarity can be really, really helpful, particularly if you're from the global south. I mean, generally I work in the global south, and it's very unfair, but those of us in the global north have a stronger voice in the international community. And I think being aware of that, trying not to perpetuate colonialism and this very colonialist approach I think that human rights often has, but being aware that you can help amplify voices. And so something that's been helpful in a lot of the work really across the planet that I've worked on, but I'll focus on Bolivia because I talked about Bolivia today, is Bolivia's uniquely colonialist still. Like I said, until just after post-Black October, it had always been basically Spanish running the country since they came for centuries. And so there is this deference by the ruling class to the global north. It's really unfortunate that, the victims talked about the abuses in the Goni case and nobody cared. The second that Americans started talking about it, boy, did they care. And boy, did that actually move the needle quite a bit by a ruling class who didn't believe it. And all of a sudden, a bunch of gringos believed it. Again, that's really, I think that's problematic, but I think understanding that the role, especially those of us who are lawyers and professionals, we do have a voice, and I think we can partner with communities, and I think we can link communities. The Goni case was a classmate of Anoush, and a student of mine. Actually, I never taught her, but like Anoush, I think she basically lived in my office, and we talked about human rights for hours and hours and hours every week. Is Tamil. She's from Sri Lanka, and the Goni case, they read about it on a chat room, and they thought, oh my God, they held the president accountable. Maybe we can do this. So they brought a case against the defense minister in the United States in the same way, and drawing these links, because let's be real, the struggles around the world, there's so many parallels. And the more you can draw these links and unite communities, I think you get strength in that. And so I think a mixture of mixing with other communities who've been marginalized, and those of us who are in positions of power or have privilege, using our privilege to amplify voices of communities who've been smothered, unfortunately.
I would also like to mention that in my case, I didn't look for activists or volunteers who would be able to support and help me. The people who have shared the same ideas, who we were guided with, they found us, they stood by us, and they voiced the issues and among their own circles, and also with the work that was done jointly, we were able to achieve good results or some results. And I think that what is very important is the coordinated work in order to be able to draw parallels with the lobbyism, as well as important work that the authorities are doing. So this is also important to disseminate information and make the people know about it. And this is what depends on how much time it would take to solve the problems.
We had a question over here.
So you came to Armenia a few months ago, and you even ended up going to Artsakh. Am I right? Okay, tell me if that type of a trip for a non-Armenian in this world of amplifying voices is an effective way of engaging people like you. Was that help? Could you just?
So I can speak to. So I came, but I also came with students. We brought some students from Wesleyan and Yale, and I will just say that they've explicitly stated this has changed their life. These are folks who knew very little about Armenia. I think they probably fell into the category earlier where I said may not have even known where Armenia was. And they did desk research and learned about it, and were certainly interested when they did the desk research from the United States. But meeting folks like Tigran or Mel's and people here was quite literally life-changing for them. They are obsessively typing, probably as we speak, up notes and working on this stuff. They really need to focus on their classes, but I've been told that they spent too much because it was changing. It literally, they met people, they heard their voices and felt this is something I want to commit myself to. So I think drawing bridges between communities, again, can be other marginalized communities, other victims of abuses to, for those of us who are in privileged positions, it completely changes. And I think, lawyers, we often are so distanced from what the work we work on, but the more we can kind of connect with communities, I think the more we can really learn from them. Because at the end of the day, we're going to learn a lot more from him than you'll ever learn from me, honestly. And so I think this trip was incredibly powerful for me, but for the students that I worked with, so much so that they are exclusively, every single one of them is, I'm going to go into human rights. I'm going to be a human rights lawyer. It was changing. It changed their lives. So I think it's incredibly powerful.
We have a question back here. Yeah, Michael.
Hello? It's on? Okay. Thank you very much for these presentations. Very enlightening. One thing I wanted to mention is that one could almost stay within the law without going to quasi-legal strategies, but going to quasi-human rights strategies within the world of the laws that are there to achieve human rights results. One thing I'm looking at, for example, involving Guantanamo is the use of a clause in the treaty that leased Guantanamo from Cuba to the United States, which prohibits the presence of private enterprise at the base. The U.S. has more or less been ignoring this in modern decades since the Cuban Revolution, but used to take it seriously. And it is something that today gives rise to things like the functioning of the prison at Guantanamo being dependent on private enterprise. And that can be a potential route toward achieving human rights results that traditional human rights law has been unable to budge. And so there's a lot of law out there about all sorts of stuff, and maybe something other than human rights law can be a route toward achieving human rights results as well. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Yeah, if I can respond to it, because I totally agree. I think we need to be creative. Like I said, throw it at the wall and see what sticks. I mean, be strategic about it, but I think there are creative ways you can hold people accountable. It could be through the WTO. It can be through, internal complaint mechanisms in the World Bank. I mean, there's many ways. There's ways to put pressure on. And the case against Goni is a perfect example. The Alien Tort Statute was literally made by the founding fathers of the United States to go against pirates because no one had jurisdiction over pirates. They're in the seas. How do we hold them accountable? And again, I don't want to talk too much about it because I have a feeling that Judith Chomsky, who's going to speak shortly, is going to speak to this. But the Center for Constitutional Rights figured out maybe we can use this against human rights violators. And so this is a statute that was initially created for pirates, not for human rights. There were no human rights when the founding, or at least the discourse of human rights did not exist. So this statute for pirates was used and has been probably the most effective mechanism for holding accountable human rights violators in the United States, in lawsuits at least. So no, I think there's certainly ways. There are other spaces to do this, and it just means being creative lawyers. It's using all that stuff we theoretically learned in law school.
There's a question here, yeah.
Sorry. In terms of strategies that individuals might pursue with their own social and professional networks, inviting people to visit Armenia and Artsakh, person by person, friendship circle by friendship circle, and then asking them when they return to write letters to their local news media for coverage. That's one way of trying to raise the visibility, and it works in other policy domains to encourage news people to cover the issues, if you think that would be valuable.
Oh, absolutely. I agree, 100%. And I think something unique about Armenians is, boy, the diaspora is powerful and they're everywhere. So I think Armenians and non-Armenians can play this role. But I think, the difference between, for instance, Bolivia, there are not, I could probably count on my hand the number of ethnic Aymara or Quechua Bolivians that are living in the United States. And the ones that do generally are, they don't have the resources, the political context, the connections. And I think the Armenian community abroad is very diverse and does have, there's a big presence and can be a really important voice. And so I think collaborating with them and folks coming here, as you both mentioned, I think that can make all the difference. And then going back and sharing what people have learned here. And I think the press is totally key. It's key. Because if nobody knows what's happening, you're not going to move the needle.
Christopher has a question. Sorry.
Thanks very much for the presentations. Thomas, you referred to a disinformation campaign by the ex-president's council or lobbyist firms or what have you. And I'd be interested in drilling down on that a little bit. How do you deal with disinformation? So for example, when raising issues of POWs, the Azeri response initially was, well, the Armenians are not cooperating in terms of revealing where landmines are, right? Now, regardless of whether that's true or not, and I'd be interested if anyone had any particular insights on that, you know, under international humanitarian law, you can't have that kind of tit for tat action, right? You know, that kind of reprisal is not permitted. So regardless, but it was a disinformation campaign that would lead people who are not familiar with the conflict to go, oh, well, there we go. It's, you know, tit for tat. The both-siderism term that got used yesterday would apply and so on. So wondering specifically, how do you deal with disinformation in terms of these legal and quasi-legal strategies? Thanks.
Happy to. In short, I don't know. I think it's really hard because I think social media is new. So, for instance, in Bolivia, social media. I mean, when the coup happened in 2019 in Bolivia, there was something the Inter-American Commission found that week there was a million tweets from fake accounts with the hashtag "no es golpe," like it's not a coup, and that became the dominant narrative. And then you have lobbyists, and then the CLS Strategies, this consulting firm that the government hired, who's, you know, they're top level advisors to Biden and Obama. I mean, they have direct contacts with the government. So they're spreading misinformation both publicly and kind of behind the scenes. It's hard. I think you push back, at least like with mainstream commercial media. I think facts are powerful, but I think being very concrete and having very clear, simple talking points, because I think this is why people are effective. At the end of the day, again, folks unfortunately don't know what's happening in Artsakh. And even if you don't believe the narrative of Azerbaijan, there's so much dust in the air, it's just like hard to know what's happening. So I think being very clear, in some ways, I guess it depends so much on each situation, but I think depoliticizing it and saying, really like amplifying voices, saying, this person was tortured. There's nothing that justifies that. And so I think having very simple, clear messages is the easiest way to break through all that noise, because it's noisy. It's effective because, again, whether you believe their position or not, best case scenario is, I don't know what the hell's going on. So I think for me, I found, at least in the Bolivia context, simplifying the message, being very direct, or, you know, countering it with real facts. But I think it's hard because I think most people live in a bubble, and much of the news they get is on social media or in their circles. And so, you know, if you watch Fox News in the United States, you watch Fox News. Or if you don't even watch that, your WhatsApp group is all a bunch of folks that hold this position. It's really hard to break into that. I just don't know. I think everyone's kind of figuring out, because this is such a new phenomenon that I'm not an expert on, but trying hard.
We're nearly at, so I'm going to ask that if anyone has any follow-up questions, please find our wonderful panelists later on, because we only have a couple of minutes. In those remaining minutes, what I would like the panelists to do is, in 1 or 2 sentences, give us one specific, not a quasi-legal strategy that each person in the audience can do in the next week or 2 to support people impacted by the 2020 war. 1 or 2 sentences, if possible. Let's see. Take a second to think. It's okay.
I think it is very important that all participants of this conference express their opinion and everything they gained at the conference in these 3 years, and send a message to all respective responsible authorities, responsible institutions who have a certain mandate to solve the problems in Armenia and Artsakh.
Still thinking.
Yeah.
I have like 1,000 sentences. 1 or 2. I think, actually, I think you mentioned it. I think going back, this is a very U.S.-centric approach, or those of us who are based somewhere else, is telling the press what's happening, telling Congress people what's happening. Pick really clear examples of Tell them people are being tortured. Tell them that there are prisoners of war still unaccounted for. Pick really clear examples and go to the press, write a congressperson. Usually, actually, I think like that's a generic response. Oh, you know, reach out to your congressperson. I actually think in this case, it can be really effective. And I think, you know, there's the Leahy Amendment. I'm already going over sentences, but I think that there's a space, and I think people actually care. I just think they don't know what's going on. And I think information is the first step.
I think I'm struggling to answer the question because I don't know which campaign we have. Like, should it be going to Section 907 in the Congress to have them, you know, try to defund arms to Azerbaijan? I don't even know the status of that. I guess I don't know which campaigns are right now. And that's been something I've been thinking about this whole conference, that this conference actually spurred for me to keep thinking about, is what organized campaigns do we have? Yes, I can say share a video from CFTJ on your Facebook, but without an action item or a call to action, I don't yet have an answer for you. I think all of you should go watch the videos. That is something you can do now, and hear more of the voices like Tigran and his brother, and stay in touch with CFTJ or stay following their work. But I think also stay tuned for calls to action. I think that's what the next panel will be about in the big room, how to build those calls to action. And hopefully people in this room and government officials and everybody have more ideas than I do of what the actual calls to action are. And we can, in organized fashion, share them with people so you have things that you can do when you get home besides watching videos, which is really important.
So we'll work to keep listening to people. Thank you so much.